It was 19 degrees on Thanksgiving night when my father changed the locks while I was still standing on the porch in my socks. I want to say I screamed or pounded on the door or did something a person with any fight left would do. I didn't. I just stood there on the front steps of the house I'd grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut, watching the storm come sideways off the sound, and I listened to the deadbolt turn through 3 inches of mahogany. Inside, the dining room was lit up gold and warm. I could see all of them through the bay window. My father at the head of the table, my stepmother refilling wine, my stepsister cutting into the pecan pie I'd spent the afternoon baking. Nobody looked at the window. Why would they? I'd already been edited out of the evening. And then, maybe 40 minutes later, when I'd stopped being able to feel my fingers and the wind chill had dropped into the single digits, 2 headlights came up the long gravel drive. A black Suburban, the kind with the heavy doors. It stopped right at the foot of the steps. The back door opened, and a woman I hadn't seen in 9 years stepped out into the snow without flinching, like the cold worked for her too, my grandmother. The one my father always called out of the picture. The one he swore had lost her mind and her money and her right to an opinion. She looked at me shaking on the steps. She looked up at the bright warm house full of people eating my pie, and she said one word. Foreclose. Before I tell you what that word cost them, do me a favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm not asking for the algorithm. I'm asking because nights like the one I'm about to describe make you feel like the only person in the world, and I don't want you to feel that way while you listen. So tell me you're out there. Then stay with me, because this is the part where everything turned. I didn't have time to ask what she meant. 2 men got out of the front of the Suburban. Not bodyguards exactly, more like the kind of quiet, capable people who appear when serious money has a problem to solve. They didn't knock on my father's door. They didn't ask permission. One of them just walked up onto the porch, took off his own coat, wrapped it around my shoulders, and half carried me to the truck, because my legs had stopped working the way legs are supposed to. I remember the heated leather seat. I remember the smell of expensive heat and pine and cold air leaving my lungs. And I remember my grandmother sitting across from me, not crying, not gasping, not asking if I was all right. She reached down, pulled a folded wool blanket off the seat, and dropped it in my lap. Arms in, she said. Pity won't warm you. Get the blood moving. I fumbled the blanket around me. My teeth were going so hard I thought they'd chip. When I finally got a word out, it came out small and stupid. I just said the gravy was salty. That's all. He asked how it was, and I said it was a little salty, and he... Stop. She held up one hand. She had rings on it worth more than the SBA loan that had buried me. You think this is about gravy? He said I embarrassed him in front of... He locked you outside in a nor'easter, she said, because for 1 second, in front of people he's trying to impress, you stopped performing gratitude. That's the whole crime. You forgot to be small. She looked out the tinted window at the house, at the warm, gold rectangle of the dining room. He didn't punish you for talking back. He punished you for not making him feel large enough. In that house, you were never his daughter. You were his mirror, and he has always hated what it shows him. I don't know how to explain what those words did to me. For 3 months, I'd been living under his roof, believing I was the problem, that the bankruptcy was proof I was reckless and worthless, that if I just kept my head down, said thank you enough times, took the comments at dinner without flinching, eventually, I'd earn my way back into being a person they could love. And in one sentence, she took that whole structure and showed me the load-bearing lie underneath it. I should back up. You probably wondering why a grown woman was living in her father's house in the first place, taking that kind of treatment. The honest answer is money. 2 years ago, I had my own firm. Small, 6 people, a coffee machine that was always broken, a lease in a converted mill outside Hartford. We did adaptive reuse design, turning dead industrial buildings into apartments and shared workspace, and we were good. We were about to close on a contract that would have set us up for a decade. I had everything I owned writing on it. A bridge loan, a personal line of credit. I'd guaranteed with my name every dollar I'd saved since college. And then, 2 weeks before closing, my bank pulled the line of credit, no warning. The anchor client got concerns from somewhere about my firm's stability and walked. Within a month, I went from being a founder to being a person sleeping in her car in a Whole Foods parking lot, doing the math on which credit card had the longest grace period. I filed Chapter 7. I lost the firm, the lease, the coffee machine, the version of myself that thought she'd made it. My father offered me a room. He made it sound like grace. "Family takes care of family, Camille," he said on the phone. And I cried with relief because I was so tired. I didn't understand yet that the room came with a subscription fee, and the fee was my dignity, paid in daily installments. Silence while my stepmother narrated my failure to her friends like a cautionary tale. A smile while my father lectured me about real discipline over scotch he hadn't earned a drop of. Gratitude while my stepsister borrowed my things, opened my mail, treated me like unpaid help in the house I'd learned to ride a bike in front of. I told myself I was being resilient. Sitting in that truck, I finally understood I'd just been getting trained. "I didn't think he'd actually do it," I said. "Lock me out. I thought he was just being dramatic, scaring me." My grandmother didn't look away from the house. That's the trap. Cruelty like his never knocks on the front door. It moves in slowly, a degree at a time, until you've taught yourself to call the cold normal. She finally turned to me, and her eyes weren't kind, exactly, but they were the first eyes that had looked at me like I mattered in a very long time. He didn't start with deadbolts. Men like him never do. They start with the corrections, the eye rolls, the way they keep you waiting in the cold of their disappointment until you'll do anything for a little warmth. By the time the lock turns, you've already done the cruelest part for him. You decided it's your fault. I started crying then, finally, and she let me. She didn't reach over and hug me. She just sat there and let me fall apart in the warm dark, which somehow felt more like love than anything I'd gotten in years. When I'd run out, I asked the question I'd been afraid to ask since the Suburban pulled up. "How did you even know I was out here?" That got the first, almost smile out of her. She tapped a tablet mounted on the seat console, and a video feed came up, the doorbell camera, the one my father had installed to watch the delivery drivers. There I was, in grainy color, getting shut out into the storm. "Marisol," she said, our housekeeper. The woman who'd worked in that house since before my mother died, who used to sneak me extra dessert when I was 8. She kept your mother's phone number all these years and called the new one when she saw what he did. She's been my eyes in that house for a decade. She loved your mother. She has been waiting a very long time to make that call. I didn't understand all of what that meant yet. I understood the part about my mother, though. My mother had been gone since I was 16. And in our family, she was the door nobody opened. My father had remarried inside of a year and built a whole new life on top of the place where she used to be, and I learned to never mention her at dinner because of what it did to his face. My grandmother tapped the screen again, and the feed switched to a different camera. The dining room. The backup angle, from the smart system my father loved to brag about, the one he didn't realize was registered to the trust that actually owned the property and not to him. "Watch," she said. In the warm gold light of that room, nobody was panicking. Nobody was at the window wondering if I'd frozen to death 20 feet away. They were laughing. My stepmother was telling some story with her hands. And my stepsister had gotten up from the table and was standing at the sideboard, and she'd opened the small cedar box that I kept on the dresser in my room. The only thing of value I had left in the world. It held my mother's pearls, the one she'd worn at her own wedding, the one heirloom my father hadn't managed to fold into his second marriage. My stepsister was holding them up to her throat in the mirror, turning her head, deciding how they'd look on her. "She thinks I'm gone," I said. My voice came out flat and far away. "You are gone," my grandmother said quietly. "In their version of tonight, you stormed off into the snow to make a scene, and now they get to divide what you left behind. Your stepmother is already telling that girl it's fine, that you always overreact, that you'd want her to have them." She watched the screen with the patience of a person who has been waiting years for this exact minute. She is teaching that child that your pain is a performance and your things are unclaimed. That is what your father built in that house, a factory for turning cruelty into furniture. Something happened to me then. The crying stopped. I watched my stepsister fasten my dead mother's pearls around her own neck, and I felt something cold and steady move into the place where the panic had been. Not rage, exactly. Something quieter and worse for them than rage. My grandmother saw it. I think she'd been waiting for it. She picked up a phone, an actual phone, not the tablet, and she didn't dial. She just spoke into it. "Mr. Castellano, we're ready. Bring the file." A car I hadn't noticed, parked further down the drive, flicked its lights on. "Who's that?" I said. "The estate's attorney." She finally let herself smile, and it was a terrible, beautiful thing. "Camille. There's something your father never told you, because telling you would have ended his entire arrangement. You think you walked into that house tonight with nothing. No money, no car, no keys, no name." She leaned forward. "You walked in as the landlord. You just didn't know it yet. Let's go introduce your father to his actual lease." I want to tell you that I marched up to that house full of righteous fire. The truth is, my legs barely worked, and I went up those steps clutching a stranger's coat. But I went. My grandmother didn't ring the bell of the house her own late husband had built. She had a key. Of course she had a key. The door swung open, and the storm came in with us, a gust of snow across the foyer that killed the warmth of the room in about 4 seconds. I followed 2 steps behind her, with the lawyer behind me carrying a leather case, and the whole house seemed to feel us before it saw us, the way a room goes quiet right before something breaks. We came into the dining room, and I watched them freeze, one at a time, like a photograph developing. My father, mid-laugh, a glass of wine halfway to his mouth. My stepmother, fork in the air. My stepsister, who saw me first, saw me alive, saw me standing there, and saw my mother's pearls around her own neck in the same instant, and went the color of the tablecloth. "Mother." My father's voice cracked right down the middle. He set his glass down too hard, and wine slopped onto the table runner. We weren't expecting you. The roads are closed, the storm." My grandmother walked into the center of the room. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't sit. She looked at the table, the picked-over turkey, the half-eaten pie, the easy warmth of it. The way a health inspector looks at a kitchen right before she shuts it down. "Turn off the music," she said. It wasn't a request. My stepsister scrambled for the speaker remote, and the jazz died. My father stood up, and I watched him put on his investor face, the one I'd seen him use on bankers and contractors my whole life. Charming. Wounded. Reasonable. "Mom, you scared the daylights out of us. We were just having a quiet family dinner. Let me get you a chair." "You must be freezing, honey. Get my mother a..." "I'm not cold," my grandmother said. "Camille was." She stepped aside, and the light fell on me. I saw my stepmother's mouth open and close. I saw my stepsister's hand go to her throat, to the pearls, like she could hide them by touching them. My father didn't look ashamed. That's the thing I want you to understand about people like him. He looked annoyed, inconvenienced, like a magician whose trick had been spoiled by a heckler in the front row. "Camille," he said with this tired, performing sigh, shaking his head. "I see you ran straight to your grandmother. You always do this. You always have to make yourself the victim." He turned to her, spreading his hands. "Mom, she had a tantrum at the table. She was rude to Sylvia in front of guests. She stormed off. She does this. You don't know how she's been since the business." "You changed the locks," I said. My voice was raw from the cold, but it didn't shake. "I heard the deadbolt. I watched you through the window. Then I watched her. I looked at my stepsister, put on Mom's pearls." My father waved a hand like he was clearing smoke. "It's a drafty house, Camille. We were keeping the heat in. Don't be dramatic. The pearls are family heirlooms. They belong in the family. This is exactly the kind of..." "They belong to my mother," I said. The room got very quiet. My grandmother turned to the lawyer. "Mr. Castellano, walk us through the timeline." He set the leather case on the dining table, right on the edge of the pie, and snapped the latches open. The sound was very loud. "We have the doorbell footage, time-stamped," he said in the bored-even voice of a man who does this for a living. "We have the interior cameras, which are registered to the trust, not to Mr." He glanced at my father, "not to the current resident." The subject was outside, in measured 19-degree air with a sub-10 wind chill, for 43 minutes. "In this state, Mr. Perrin," Castellano said, "that's reckless endangerment at a minimum. I'd argue further, but that's not actually the most urgent problem in this room tonight." My father laughed. It came out thin. "Problem? This is my house. I'll discipline my own daughter however I—" "This is not your house," my grandmother said. And the air went out of him. "I have the deed," he said. "I've had the deed for years. It's in the safe upstairs. You have a piece of paper," she said, "that I let you keep, because as long as you believed it meant something, you stayed out of the things that actually matter." She nodded to the lawyer, who lifted a thick, bound document out of the case and set it on the table where everyone could see it. It did not look festive. It looked like a verdict. This house, the land it sits on, and the controlling interest in Ashford Maritime were placed into an irrevocable trust before you ever married into this family. Your wife, my Eleanor, was the steward of that trust, not the owner, the steward. Her voice didn't rise, but it got colder, and I watched my father shrink under it. "And the trust names a single beneficiary, the firstborn daughter of Eleanor, to vest, in full, on her 30th birthday." She looked at me. "You turned 30 on Tuesday, Camille," she said. "Happy birthday." I have tried 100 times to describe what that moment felt like, and I keep failing. The closest I can get is this. My whole life, I had stood in front of that man feeling like a guest who'd overstayed, a charity case, a problem he was generous enough to house. And in one sentence, the floor under us simply reversed. I wasn't the guest. I never had been. He was. For 14 years, my father had been living in my mother's house, spending the edges of my trust, lecturing me about real discipline from inside an inheritance he'd married his way into, and then convinced everyone he'd built. He turned to me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see the man who controlled my allowance and my self-worth. I saw a squatter who'd just been handed an eviction notice. "You knew," he said, and the venom came right back. "You planned this. You and her, you set this up." "I didn't know anything," I said. And it was true, and that was somehow the part that broke him. I thought I was broke. I thought I'd ruined my own life. I slept in my car. I filed for bankruptcy. I came back here and let you talk to me like garbage because I thought I deserved it. "You crashed your own company," my stepmother spat, finding her voice. "You're a failure, Camille. Everyone knows it. You can't run a household, let alone." "She didn't crash anything," my grandmother said. "She was sabotaged." She let that sit. We pulled the records because something about the timing of her collapse never made sense to me. Her line of credit was called by a regional bank where a certain board member happens to golf every Saturday with her father. Her anchor client received a quiet, anonymous warning about her firm's instability 2 weeks before closing. The man who lectured her about discipline spent 6 months engineering her failure so she'd have nowhere to go but back under his roof. She looked at her son with something that wasn't even hatred anymore. It was disappointment, which is so much worse. You broke her legs, Howard. So you could be the one who offered her the wheelchair. And tonight you kicked it out from under her in a snowstorm. "I raised her," my father shouted and slammed his hand on the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. "I put food on this table. I kept a roof over her head when she had nothing." "It was never your roof," the lawyer said, not even looking up from his papers. "As of your wife's death, you've held a courtesy tenancy at the trust's discretion, which means technically, the moment the new beneficiary withdraws that courtesy, you're trespassing." My father's face went a shade of red I'd never seen on a human being. Trespassing. I'm her father. By marriage to her mother, I said. I walked across the room to my stepsister, who shrank back into her chair. I reached out and, very gently, I unclasped my mother's pearls from her neck. She didn't fight me. Her hands were shaking. "And legally," I said, holding the pearls in my fist, "you're a liability I just inherited." The lawyer turned to me, not to my grandmother, to me. And that was the moment I understood the whole thing had already changed hands. "Ms. Ashford," he said, "what would you like to do?" I looked at my father. He was breathing hard, sweating, eyes darting around the room for an angle, a lie, a lever. And I watched him decide to play the only card he had left. I watched him get ready to talk about blood and family and loyalty and all the warm things he blocked outside in the snow 40 minutes ago. "Camille," he started, and his voice went soft, almost tender. "The most dangerous version of him. Sweetheart, we're family. You can't actually listen to me. I was hard on you because I wanted to make you strong. Everything I did to toughen you up. Look at you. Look how strong you turned out. That was me. That was." "I want them out," I said. The room held its breath. And here is the part I think about most, the part that took me a long time to make peace with. Because I had it in me, in that second, to do to them exactly what he'd done to me. The storm was screaming against the windows. The wind chill was below zero. There was a version of me, and I felt her, right there under my skin, who wanted to put all three of them out on those steps in their stocking feet and pull the curtains and let them learn, degree by degree, what they'd taught me. I looked at the bay window, the same window I'd stood outside of, looking in, watching them eat my pie while I lost the feeling in my hands. And I made myself a different kind of promise than the one revenge wanted. "Mr. Castellano," I said, "I want them out of this house tonight, permanently. They leave with what they're wearing and what they can carry in one bag, and nothing of my mother's leaves with them. Not one thing." I took a breath. "But I'm not my father. So there's a car waiting at the end of the drive, and it's going to take them to a hotel in town, on my account, for 1 week. Long enough to find somewhere to land. After that, they're not my problem, and they're not my family." I looked right at him. "That's more warmth than you gave me. That's the difference between us. Remember it." My grandmother looked at me, and for the first time that whole night, her face cracked into something real. Pride. It was the proudest anybody had ever looked at me. "You heard the owner," she said to the two men by the door. It wasn't a polite escort. My father didn't go quietly. He lunged at me, and one of the men caught him by the arm, and he started yelling about loyalty and blood and everything he was owed while they walked him toward the front door he'd locked me out of. My stepmother followed, clutching her cardigan, shrieking about lawyers, about how this wasn't over, about how I regret this. My stepsister went last, and she paused in the doorway and looked back at me. And there was something in her face that wasn't quite an apology, but was at least the beginning of understanding what she'd been raised inside of. I didn't say anything to her. I just held my mother's pearls a little tighter. The front door opened. The storm howled in, hungry, and I watched my father step out onto the porch where I'd stood, into the snow, into the cold he built for me. He turned around, he looked at the warm, bright house, at the lights, at me standing in it. "Camille," he said, "open the door." I walked to the bay window instead. I put my hand flat against the cold glass, the way I had from the other side an hour before, when I was the one out there in the dark looking in. He saw me do it. I watched him understand. Then I reached up and I drew the heavy curtains closed, slow, until there was nothing left to see, and the warmth stayed inside where it belonged, with me. "For close," I said. "Quiet. Just for the house, just for my mother, just for the girl who'd been standing on those steps believing she deserved it." The room behind me was silent except for the fire and the scratch of the lawyer's pen finishing the last of the documents. My grandmother walked to the sideboard, poured 2 glasses of something amber and old, and pressed one into my hand. "Sit down before you fall down," she said. But she said it gently. She touched the side of my face once, the way my mother used to. "Welcome home, Camille. If you've ever been the one standing outside the window in your own family, the disappointment, the cautionary tale, the one who ruined the holidays just by telling the truth at the table, then I need you to hear me before you go. You were never the broken one. You were the only honest person in a house built on a lie. And that is a very lonely thing to be, And it is not the same as being wrong. Subscribe if you made it out the other side. And share this with somebody you love who is still standing in the cold, waiting for headlights, not knowing yet that the deed has always been in their name. For a long time after that night, I kept going back to one small detail. My father asked me how the gravy was. I told him the truth, and that was the whole crime. Not theft, not betrayal, not anything that would hold up in a court. I simply stopped performing gratitude for 1 second, and a grown man decided I should freeze for it. It took me years to understand that the locked door wasn't the beginning of his cruelty. It was just the first time he made it loud. The cold had been moving into that house 1 degree at a time since I was 16, since the year my mother died and nobody was allowed to say her name at the table. What I've learned is that cruelty always tells you who it is, long before it locks the door. The eye roll, the correction, the way you're kept waiting in someone's disappointment until you'll do anything for a little warmth. Those are the early degrees, and the cruelest trick of it is that by the time the deadbolt turns, you've already done the worst part to yourself. You've decided you earned it. I had spent 3 months believing I was the problem, that my bankruptcy was proof I was worthless, that if I just stayed small enough, I'd be allowed back inside. The bravest thing I ever did wasn't kicking my father out. It was letting myself believe my grandmother when she told me I was sabotaged, not broken. But the part I'm proudest of came at the very end, when I had it in me to do to them exactly what he'd done to me. The storm was right there. The cold was free and waiting. I could have put all 3 of them out in their socks and pulled the curtains and called it justice. I didn't. I put them in a car to a hotel for a week instead, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't weakness and it wasn't forgiveness. It was that I refused to let Howard reach across that whole night and turn me into a copy of him. Becoming the thing that hurt you is the last revenge it gets to take. I wasn't going to hand it that. So, if you take anything from what happened to me and Marisol and my grandmother in that house, let it be 3 things, woven together because they don't work apart. Keep your sense of right and wrong even when the people who raised you tell you it's a flaw. That's the part of you they most want to break, and the part you most need to protect. Stay sharp enough to see the trap before it closes, because Howard didn't beat me with strength, he beat me for years with a story I never thought to question. And find the toughness to stand on a freezing porch, lose everything, sleep in your car, and still walk back through that door when the headlights finally come. You don't always get a grandmother in a black SUV, but the deed to your own life has always been in your name. Most people just never get told to read the beneficiary line.